Hi, I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've been living on my own for the past 5 years. I moved out right after college, landed a decent job, and have been building a comfortable life for myself. My apartment is nothing fancy, but I've worked hard to make it my own, buying furniture, gadgets, and other things little by little. Everything in my space has meaning because I earned it. For me, it's more than just stuff. It's proof that I can stand on my own 2 feet. Now, let me tell you about my family. My younger sister is 25 and recently moved back in with our parents after losing her job. She's been having a rough time financially, and I get it. Life isn't always easy. I moved out partly because my family has always leaned a little too hard on the idea that we should share everything growing up. My stuff wasn't really mine. It was ours. That mindset never sat well with me. Moving out gave me the space and freedom I needed. A couple of weeks ago, I got a call from my mom. She asked me if she could give my old desk and chair, which were still stored at their house, to my sister for her home office. I told her no. I hadn't taken them to my apartment yet because I was waiting until I could make room for them. They're still mine though. I paid for them when I was in college, and I told her I'd come by soon to pick them up. Mom didn't push too hard, just said she understood. I thought that was the end of it. Fast forward about a week. My cousin mentioned in passing during a casual chat that my sister's home office was coming together and that she loved the desk and chair. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it hit me she was talking about my desk and chair. To make things worse, my cousin added, "Oh, and the gaming console was a nice touch. She said you were cool with it." I wasn't cool with it. I never even knew about it. I drove over to my parents' house that weekend and asked them straight up what had happened. My dad shrugged it off, saying they figured I wouldn't mind since I wasn't actively using the desk or chair. My mom chimed in with something about how my sister needed it more right now. I asked about the gaming console, an old but still functional one I'd bought years ago, and they confirmed they'd given that to her as well. It felt like a punch in the gut. I reminded them that I'd paid for everything with my own money. The desk, the chair, the console, these weren't communal family items. My dad just sighed and said, "You know how families are supposed to share?" My mom added that I should be more understanding because my sister was going through a hard time. I turned to my sister next. She didn't even try to deny it. Her attitude was completely dismissive. She said she needed the desk to apply for jobs and the console to distress when I told her she should have asked me first. She just rolled her eyes and said, "What's the big deal? You weren't using them anyway." That wasn't the point, and she knew it. This wasn't about the desk or the console, it was about respect. It was about boundaries. But anytime I brought that up, my parents and sister would pivot back to how I was being selfish or causing drama. I tried to resolve things peacefully. I asked for my stuff back, just the desk and chair, but my parents acted like that would be impossible. They said taking them back now would disrupt my sister's setup and create unnecessary conflict. I pointed out that the conflict already existed because they went behind my back, but they refused to see it that way. My dad even accused me of being petty, saying it's just furniture. Let it go. Frustrated, I turned to Reddit. I posted about the situation, explaining how my parents and sister had completely disregarded my ownership and left me feeling disrespected. The response was overwhelming. People validated my feelings, shared similar stories, and encouraged me to stand my ground. Some even gave detailed advice on how to handle the situation without escalating things too much. Their support gave me the clarity I needed. I decided I wasn't going to let this slide. I couldn't keep letting my family brush aside my boundaries. So I came up with a plan. I would go to my parents' house the next day and reclaim what was mine. But this time, I wouldn't argue or let them guilt me into backing down. I'd simply take back my belongings and leave. Before I ended the call with my dad that night, he warned me not to make a scene if I came over. That just made me more determined. I packed some tools into my car, set my alarm for early the next morning, and got ready to take action. Update 1. The next morning, I got up early, loaded a set of tools into my car, and headed to my parents' house. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't want to give them the chance to stall or come up with excuses. By the time I pulled into the driveway, it was barely 8 a.m. The house was quiet, and I figured everyone was still in their morning routines. When I knocked, my mom answered the door, looking surprised to see me. I told her I was there to pick up my desk and chair. Her expression shifted, like she was trying to figure out how to stop me without outright saying no. Instead of giving her a chance, I stepped inside and headed toward the room where I knew my sister had set up her so-called office. The desk and chair were right there, along with a few other things that looked suspiciously familiar, like my old lamp and a decorative clock I thought I'd thrown away. My mom followed behind, trying to convince me that this wasn't necessary and that we could talk about it later, but I wasn't interested in more talking. I reminded her I'd already made it clear I wanted my stuff back. As I started to take apart the desk, my sister burst into the room. She looked furious. She accused me of being petty and trying to cause drama over a bunch of old furniture. I stayed calm and told her that this wasn't about furniture, it was about respect. That didn't go over well. She demanded to know why I couldn't just let her have the desk since she needed it more. The noise drew my dad into the room, and he immediately tried to de-escalate the situation by suggesting we all calm down and talk. I told him there wasn't much to talk about. These were my belongings, and I was taking them home. He sighed and said I was making a big deal out of nothing. But I wasn't going to budge. That's when things really escalated. My mom started in with the guilt trips, asking if I really wanted to tear the family apart over a desk. My dad chimed in, saying my sister was under a lot of stress and that I was making her situation worse. Meanwhile, my sister kept ranting about how unfair I was being. I didn't raise my voice, but I did point out that taking someone else's property without permission wasn't just disrespectful, it could technically be considered theft. That shut everyone up for a moment. My sister scoffed and called me ridiculous, but I could tell the word theft hit a nerve. Ignoring the protests, I continued disassembling the desk. My mom begged me to reconsider, saying this wasn't worth the damage it would do to our family. I told her that the damage had already been done when they decided my things were up for grabs without asking me first. As I was finishing up with the desk, my cousin, yes, the same one who tipped me off about this whole situation, showed up unannounced. She was dropping something off for my mom, but when she walked in and saw what was happening, she immediately sided with me. She called out my sister's entitlement, saying it wasn't right for her to take my things without permission. That gave me a small boost of confidence, knowing I wasn't the only one who thought this was wrong. Of course, my sister wasn't having any of it. She started yelling about how I was ruining her chances to get back on her feet and that I should be helping her, not making things harder. I reminded her that she could have simply asked me directly instead of going behind my back. If she had, I might have been willing to help, but now, no chance. For the first time, my parents looked unsure. They didn't say much as I loaded the desk and chair into my car. Maybe they realized they'd overstepped, or maybe they just didn't want to argue anymore. Either way, they let me finish without trying to stop me. Before I left, I made one thing clear: I wasn't going to store anything at their house again. If this is how they treat my belongings, I can't trust them. They didn't say much in response, just watched as I drove off. On the way home, I felt a mix of emotions. I was relieved to have my things back, but the whole situation left a bitter taste in my mouth. This wasn't how family was supposed to act. I knew the fallout from this wasn't over, but at least I'd taken a stand. When I got home, I unpacked everything and logged onto Reddit to share the update. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive, with people saying I did the right thing and that it was about time I stood up for myself. Reading those responses made me feel a little better, like I wasn't overreacting. Now I just have to see how my family reacts. Something tells me this isn't the end of the drama. Update 2. After getting my desk and chair back, I thought the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong. My sister didn't waste any time letting me know how she felt about what happened. The first text came in the same day I took my stuff back. She called me selfish and accused me of trying to destroy her progress at first. I ignored it, but the messages kept coming, long paragraphs about how I was making her life harder, sprinkled with passive-aggressive comments like, "Must be nice to only think about yourself." She didn't stop there. I started hearing from extended family members who were apparently getting a very different version of the story. My sister told everyone that I ripped apart her office setup and left her with nothing. She conveniently left out the part where she took my things without asking. My parents didn't help either. They let her vent about me during family gatherings and even chimed in with their own complaints about how I was being too rigid and not understanding enough. It became clear that I wasn't going to get any kind of apology from them. Instead, they expected me to smooth things over. My mom left me a voicemail saying I should be the bigger person and talk to my sister to make things right. It was frustrating, to say the least, but I wasn't going to play into their narrative. I decided it was time to draw a line. I blocked my sister on social media and muted my parents' texts for a while. As I unpacked the desk and set it up in my apartment, I couldn't help but think about why it mattered so much to me. That desk wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was the first big purchase I made when I started working. It represented my independence. Seeing it in my space again felt like reclaiming a part of myself that my family had overlooked. Then, out of nowhere, I got a heads up from a family friend. She told me my parents were planning a family meeting to confront me about the whole situation. Apparently, my mom and sister had convinced a few relatives that I needed to be taught a lesson about sharing and family values. I wasn't entirely surprised, but it still stung to know how far they were willing to go. Not long after, my aunt called. She didn't beat around the bush. She accused me of causing unnecessary drama and said I should apologize to my sister for embarrassing her. I calmly explained my side of the story, but she wasn't having it. By the end of the call, it was clear she had already made up her mind about who was in the wrong. That was the final push I needed to set stricter boundaries. I started rethinking how much access I allowed my family to have in my life. When a coworker suggested family therapy, I laughed it off at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much these patterns had shaped my relationships. Not just with my family, but with other people too. For fun, I decided to run a private poll on Reddit. I explained the situation and asked others how they'd handle a family that constantly disrespected their boundaries. The responses were eye-opening. Most people said I wasn't overreacting and that I needed to protect my space, both physically and emotionally. Just when I thought things couldn't get more ridiculous, I found out my sister had been going through more of my belongings stored at my parents' house. A friend who stopped by for dinner casually mentioned seeing my old cookware in my sister's kitchen. That's when I realized this wasn't just about the desk and chair. This was a pattern of behavior. The final straw came when my parents admitted they had given away some of my clothes. My mom brushed it off, saying I never wore them anymore. I couldn't believe it. These weren't random items gathering dust. They were things I'd kept because they mattered to me. At that point, I decided I couldn't leave anything else at their house. The next weekend, I rented a small storage unit and spent an entire day clearing out every single item I had left at their place. Books, kitchen supplies, childhood mementos, everything came with me. By the time I was done, there was nothing left for them to claim as family property. As I packed up, I reflected on how much my parents' enabling had hurt not just me, but my sister too. Their constant favoritism and refusal to hold her accountable had left her with a sense of entitlement that was now ruining her relationships. I couldn't change their behavior, but I could choose not to let it drag me down anymore. After moving everything to the storage unit, I updated Reddit again. The post blew up even more than the first one. People praised me for standing my ground and shared their own stories of dealing with entitled family members. Some even offered advice on how to stay firm without burning bridges completely. I don't know what's going to happen next, but for now, I feel like I've taken a step in the right direction. My family might not like it, but I'm done being their doormat. Update 3. A few days after I cleared out the last of my belongings from my parents' house, I got a text from my dad. It read, "We need to talk. Everyone will be here Sunday." That was it. No details, no explanation. I didn't need one. I knew this was about the fallout from the desk incident and everything that followed. It was clearly a setup, but part of me wanted to see how far they'd take this. So on Sunday, I showed up. When I walked into the living room, it felt like walking onto the set of an intervention. My parents, my sister, and two of my aunts were sitting there waiting for me. Nobody offered me a seat, so I stayed standing, arms crossed. My sister was the first to speak. She launched into a tirade about how I destroyed her chance to get back on her feet and how I turned my back on her during her time of need. She painted herself as the victim, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd taken my things without permission. Then my mom jumped in, saying the family needed to stick together and that I was being unnecessarily combative. She brought up how hard my sister's life had been lately, as if that excused everything. My dad added that this could have all been avoided if I just let it go and focused on what really mattered, keeping the family together. I stayed calm and waited for them to finish before I responded. I explained again that the issue wasn't about a desk or a gaming console or any of the other things my sister had taken. It was about boundaries and respect. I reminded them that they didn't ask me if they could take my stuff. They just decided it was okay and expected me to accept it. That was the real problem. My sister cut me off and started talking about her hardships, emphasizing how she needed the desk to apply for jobs and the console to relieve stress. She made it sound like I was some heartless villain for taking them back. I let her finish and then pointed out the obvious. she could have asked me for help. If she'd been honest and upfront, I might have been willing to lend her the desk temporarily or help her out in some other way. But instead, she went behind my back, and that's why we were in this mess. At this point, my parents tried to shift the blame. My dad claimed he thought my mom had asked me for permission, and my mom insisted she assumed I wouldn't mind it was the same excuses I'd heard before, and they weren't any more convincing the second time. They kept brushing it off as no big deal, which just proved my point. They didn't respect me or my property. I decided to stop sugarcoating things. I told them, point blank, that their behavior was enabling my sister's entitlement. Every time they made excuses for her or tried to guilt me into letting things slide, they were reinforcing the idea that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. I made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. That's when my sister started crying. She accused me of being heartless and abandoning the family over something as trivial as furniture. She said I was acting like I didn't care about anyone but myself. It was over the top and dramatic, but my parents looked genuinely uncomfortable, like they weren't sure how to respond. I decided to drop the bombshell. I told them I'd already moved everything I owned out of their house. Every book, every piece of cookware, every sentimental item, it was all gone. That way there'd be no more misunderstandings or excuses about what belonged to who. My mom looked shocked, and my dad just shook his head. My sister looked furious, like she couldn't believe I'd taken away her free pass to raid my things. One of my aunts tried to mediate. She suggested that everyone apologize and move forward, but I wasn't interested in sweeping things under the rug. I told her that forgiveness requires accountability. If my parents and sister couldn't even acknowledge what they'd done wrong, there was nothing to move forward from. By this point, my parents were getting frustrated. They accused me of overreacting and said it was just stuff. I reminded them, again, that this wasn't about the stuff, it was about the principle. If they couldn't respect me enough to ask before taking my things, how could I trust them with anything else? I decided I'd had enough. I told them I wasn't going to tolerate being disrespected by anyone, even family, and walked out. Nobody followed me. When I got home, I updated Reddit about the ambush. The responses were overwhelmingly supportive. People told me I handled it perfectly and that I was right to stand up for myself. Some even shared similar stories of their own, which made me feel less alone. I don't know what my family will do next, but at this point, I'm done trying to fix things. If they can't respect my boundaries, they don't get a place in my life. Update 4. About a week after the family meeting ambush, I got a call from my sister. I almost didn't pick up. I'd blocked her on social media and had been ignoring her texts, so I wasn't sure what she wanted now, but curiosity got the better of me. She said she wanted to apologize and asked if we could meet for coffee. Her tone was uncharacteristically calm, which caught me off guard. I wasn't sure if she was being genuine or if this was another setup, but I agreed to meet her. We met at a small cafe near my place. She was already seated when I arrived, looking unusually serious. As soon as I sat down, she started talking. She admitted she was wrong to take my desk and other belongings without asking. She said she acted out of desperation because she was struggling and didn't know how to handle things. It was the first time I'd heard anything close to an acknowledgement of her actions, and for a moment, I thought maybe this was progress. But as she kept talking, the cracks started to show. She claimed our parents had told her it was fine to use my things, so she assumed I wouldn't care. Then she tried to justify keeping some of the smaller items, like my old books and kitchenware, because they were practically hers growing up. She was clearly trying to shift some of the blame onto our parents, and even onto me for not communicating better about what I wanted to keep. It felt less like an apology and more like damage control. She pivoted to talking about her current struggles, how hard it was living at home, being unemployed, and feeling like she was falling behind in life. I listened without interrupting, but then she dropped a request. Could I help her out financially while she got back on her feet? She claimed she was close to landing a job and just needed some support to get through the next few months. I drew the line. I told her I wasn't willing to give her money. I explained that I was open to rebuilding our relationship but couldn't support her financially or enable her behavior. She didn't take it well. Her tone shifted from apologetic to defensive. She said I was making her feel like a failure and that she was trying her best. She seemed to expect me to backpedal, but I stood firm. I told her that enabling her wouldn't help her grow. The best way I could support her was by being honest. If she wanted to move forward, she needed to take responsibility for her actions and start handling her problems without relying on others to bail her out. She didn't say much after that, just nodded and said she understood, but the tension in the air was thick. Later that evening, my mom called. She told me my sister was upset after our talk and felt I had been cruel and unforgiving. Mom started up the usual guilt trip, saying family should help each other and that I was being too hard on my sister. I didn't engage much. I just told her I was done discussing it and hung up. The next day, a friend sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post my sister had written. It was one of those vague, attention-seeking rants about unsupportive family members and how some people care more about stuff than relationships. She didn't name me directly, but it was obvious who she was talking about. The comments were full of sympathetic replies from relatives and her friends, all agreeing that she deserved better. I updated Reddit about the coffee meeting and the Facebook post, asking if I'd been too harsh. Once again, the responses were overwhelmingly supportive. People pointed out that her apology seemed more about optics than genuine remorse, and that I was right to protect my boundaries. Some even suggested I go low contact with my family for a while to avoid further drama. A close friend of mine reassured me I wasn't a bad brother for setting limits. She reminded me that boundaries are about respect, not punishment. If my sister couldn't respect my boundaries, that was on her, not me. At this point, I'm more convinced than ever that my sister's apology wasn't entirely sincere. It felt like she was trying to save face after the family meeting fallout and get something out of me in the process. Her actions since then, like the Facebook post, only reinforced that suspicion. For now, I've decided to keep my distance from her and my parents. I'm not cutting them off completely, but I'm not going to engage in their drama anymore. If they want a relationship with me, they'll have to start respecting my boundaries. Until then, I'm focusing on my own life and the people who genuinely support me. Update 5. After the coffee meeting with my sister and the Facebook post fallout, I decided to take the next steps to fully regain control over my life. I spent an entire weekend clearing out every single item I still had stored at my parents' house. I thought I had already removed most of my belongings, but I was wrong. While packing up, I found even more of my things in unexpected places, old books, kitchenware, and even a few small electronics I thought had been lost. It turned out my sister had been quietly using those as well. The final straw was finding my old cookware set in her boxes. It was something I'd bought for my first apartment and intentionally left behind only because I didn't have enough space at the time. Seeing how casually it had been absorbed into her inventory made me more certain than ever that I couldn't leave anything else in that house. I loaded everything into my car and rented a small storage unit to hold anything I didn't have room for in my apartment. By the end of the weekend, I officially had nothing left in their home. I let my parents know that I wouldn't be storing anything at their place ever again. This wasn't negotiable. My dad tried to act indifferent, but my mom gave me the usual guilt trip about making things harder than they need to be. I didn't argue or explain myself further. There was no point. After that, I decided to go low contact with my family. I didn't block anyone, but I stopped responding to anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. No more long phone calls, no more family updates, no more drama. I realized how much mental space the constant back and forth had been taking up, and I wasn't going to let it control me anymore. With all that energy freed up, I started focusing on myself for the first time in a long time. I took up new hobbies, reconnected with friends I'd drifted away from, and started making more plans for my future. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Meanwhile, my sister eventually found a part-time job. While I was genuinely glad she was making progress, my family quickly turned it into another source of pressure on me. They insisted the job wasn't enough to cover her expenses and started hinting, then outright saying, that I should chip in to help her. My mom even tried to frame it as a family responsibility, saying that it's what siblings are supposed to do. I made it clear that I wasn't going to pay for her mistakes or enable her bad habits. I reminded them that I wasn't responsible for her or their financial decisions. That's when my mom hit me with what she must have thought was her ace card. She told me that if I didn't start helping the family, she'd cut me off emotionally. I wasn't sure what that even meant since she'd spent the past few months guilt-tripping me and siding with my sister. So I told her, as calmly as I could, that I'd survive just fine. Around this time, I started seeing a therapist. I'd always dismissed the idea in the past, but unpacking everything with a professional helped me understand how deep the dysfunction in my family ran. I realized I'd spent years trying to meet impossible expectations and maintain a relationship with people who didn't respect me as an individual. Therapy helped me let go of the guilt I'd been carrying and focus on building a life that worked for me, not for them. One unexpected bright spot came from my cousin, the same one who originally tipped me off about the desk. She reached out to say she admired how I stood up for myself and how I wasn't afraid to set boundaries, even with family. She said she'd had her own issues with similar dynamics and felt inspired to start pushing back too. It was nice to hear, especially since most of my interactions with family lately had been so negative. Meanwhile, my updates on Reddit gained even more traction. People seemed to resonate with my story and praise me for standing firm. Some shared their own experiences with overbearing families, and others encouraged me to keep prioritizing my mental health. It felt good to know I wasn't alone in dealing with these kinds of issues. Months later, my sister sent me another text. It was a lukewarm apology, claiming she wanted to move past everything and be a real family again, but by then, I didn't feel the need to engage. I didn't respond, and honestly, I didn't feel bad about it. If she's truly sorry, she'll show it through her actions, not her words. The family dynamic remains strained. Some relatives side with me, saying I was right to stand up for myself, while others still blame me for the conflict. I've made peace with the fact that I can't change how they feel. All I can do is control how much access they have to my life. In my final Reddit update, I thanked everyone for their support. Setting boundaries with family is never easy, but the advice and encouragement I received made it easier to stay strong. For the first time in years, I feel free from their expectations, their guilt trips, and their drama. I'm finally moving forward, on my terms.